Historical overview. As currently understood, American Indian history in Kentucky is over 11,000 years long. Events that took place before recorded history are lost to time. With the advent of recorded history, some events played out on an international stage, as in the mid-1700s, during the war between the French and English for control of the Ohio Valley region. Others took place on a national stage, as during the removal years of the early 1800s, or during the events surrounding the looting and grave desecration at Slack Farm in Union County in the late 1980s. Over these millennia, a variety of American Indian groups have contributed their stories to Kentucky's historical narrative. Some names are familiar ones, others are not. Some groups have deep historical roots in the state, others are relative newcomers. All have contributed and are contributing to Kentucky's American history, Indian history. The bulk of Kentucky's American Indian history is written within the Commonwealth's rich archaeological record. Thousands of camps, villages, and town sites, caves and rock shelters, and earthen and stone mounds, and geometric earthworks. After the mid-18th century arrival of Europeans in the state, part of Kentucky's American Indian history can be found in the newcomers' journals, diaries, letters, and maps. Although the native voices are more difficult to hear. Later history recorded in newspapers, books, and histories and encyclopedias. It also is found in the oral tradition, spiritual beliefs, art, music, and cultural events. Native peoples have passed down through generations. From this complex mix of sources, an American Indian history emerges that reflect cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity, chronicles challenges, triumphs, and losses, and paints a picture of human endurance. It can be considered in 5 broad periods. First Peoples, 9,500 BCE, CE 1539, Foreign Influences 1539 to 1730, Intersection of Two Worlds 1730-1825, Removal and its Aftermath 1825 to 1980, and Greater Visibility and Action 1980 to present. First Peoples, 9,500 BCE, CE 1539. Kentucky's ancient American Indian story belongs to the broad eastern woodlands tradition of North American Indian heritage. It shares many characteristics with the indigenous histories of the state that surround it. This period is the longest in Kentucky's American Indian history. It spans the time from the earliest migratory hunters late in the Ice Age through the time of mound building, small-scale gardeners who traded with distant peoples for copper and marine shell, to the time just before European exploration of North America, when farming groups lived in permanent villages inhabited by hundreds of people. The history shows conclusively that the myth of the dark and bloody ground, which states that American Indians never lived permanently within Kentucky's borders, see cultural contributions. is not valid with respect to either the entirety of the Commonwealth or to the complete expanse of its ancient past. Places across the state where thousands of chipped stone arrowheads and ground stone axes have been recovered were not the scenes of combat, as early historians like John Filson claim. These are the locations of Indian camps and villages built in the same places for hundreds or even thousands of years. A diversity of unique cultural expressions developed during this long time period. And despite the fact that names, languages, and particular histories are lost to us, in each case these expressions reflect the specific natural and cultural environments and historical events of the area within which they develop. Rooted in a stable foundation of hunting and gathering subsistence practices over the millennia, groups added the cultivation of plants to this mix. The first were squash and weedy plants like sunflower and goosefoot. The latter two were among several local plants domesticated by native gardening groups. Later, the plants native farming groups grew, like corn and beans, were mainly cultigens that had been domesticated in the tropics earlier. Throughout much of the period, native groups were organized tribally, but for a brief period in a few places in Kentucky, hunter-gatherer farmers created chieftain society with more complex social and political institutions. Archaeological research is the source of information for much of this initial period of Kentucky's American Indian history. Because of issues of preservation, larger sites that are easier to find and study, recent groups are better understood. Archaeologists divide this period into 5 subperiods, based largely on technological developments identified at sites documented in Kentucky, Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Woodland, late prehistoric, and historic Indian. However, since life ways served as the underlying organizing principle of this narrative, this first people's period is divided instead into 3 sub-periods: hunter-gatherers, hunter-gatherer gardeners, and hunter-gatherer farmers. Years used for this period are approximate. Hunter-gatherers, 9500 BCE to 1000 BCE. Archaeological research shows that the ancestors of Kentucky's indigenous American Indian peoples were living in what is now Kentucky by at least 9500 BCE, although they may have arrived much earlier. Over this long time period, population growth was gradual, but changes in climate and culture were dramatic. The first hunter-gatherers lived in small mobile groups that ranged within large territories. With spears, they hunted now extinct Ice Age animals like woolly mammals and mastodons, as well as other smaller mammals, and foraged for plant foods. Though never glaciated, the southern edge of the ice sheet extended near Kentucky's northern border, and so Kentucky's climate at this time resembled Canada's. By 7000 BCE, Kentucky's climate had warmed up. It rained and snowed less in the winter, and each year had long dry spells. Animal, plant, and human communities adapted to these climatic changes. People continued to hunt and gather in small bands as before. But beginning around 6000 BCE, hunters started to use the atlatl, or spear thrower, to hunt animals like deer, elk, and bear, but not buffalo. These animals would not return to the Ohio Valley until the mid-CE 1600s. They also used snares, traps, and possibly hunting dogs. for animals like raccoon, squirrel, and rabbit. These peoples exploited aquatic resources, fish and freshwater mussels, using bone, fish hooks, or nets they made from plant or animal fibers. They also collected nuts, mainly hickory nuts, as well as many different kinds of wild fruits and plants, which they prepared and processed using stone pestles, grinding stones, and nutting stones. The appearance of plant food processing tools and woodworking tools and hunter-gatherer tool inventories implies that reliance on plants was increasing. Through the centuries, as groups became more familiar with the resources of their area, hunter-gatherer life ways became more complex and diversified across Kentucky's multiple environmental zones, as evidenced by, among other things, an increase in the diversity of spear point styles. By about 1000 BCE, rainfall became more evenly distributed throughout the year. Temperatures became slightly cooler and more like today's. People gradually developed new ways to live. Group size increased, as did Kentucky's overall population. Though they still moved with the seasons, these hunter-gatherers moved less often and their homelands were smaller. Distinct hunter-gatherer cultures began to emerge. Some groups began to experiment with gardening. They encouraged squash and small seeded plants like goosefoot to grow on the trash heaps near their base camps. Before long, they began to plant seeds from these plants in areas they cleared especially for that purpose. Food was cooked using hot rocks and was likely served in baskets, gourds, or turtle shells, and stored in baskets or skin or net bags. Bone and antler served as the raw material for tools, awls and needles and ornaments, pins and beads. Beads and pendants also were made from shell. The diversity of stone tool types increased. The hunter-gatherers lived in semi-permanent base camps and in seasonal hunting and fishing camps. These camps were scattered along rivers and creeks, on ridge tops, and in rock shelters. Houses likely were small, temporary structures built of a pole framework covered with hides, mats, or brush. Families might stay at a camp for as long as a month or two before moving on, and groups would return year after year to favored resource-rich places. These larger campsites, often located near particularly rich natural resources, became the focal points for gatherings of several families. Here they held feasts and ceremonies and exchanged information and met future spouses. Ceremonies and rituals helped maintain good relationships among families and between neighboring groups. But sometimes peaceful relations broke down and interpersonal and intergroup conflicts resulted. Life revolved around family, which at that time was made up of between 15 and 20 people. It is likely that men were the hunters, while women collected plants and took care of children. Older men and women probably served as religious leaders. Political leaders likely were men who were the most successful hunters or who others respected for their common sense of intelligence. Lacking the benefits of modern medicine, infant mortality was high in hunter-gatherer communities. Those fortunate enough to reach the age of 15 could expect to live only into their mid-20s. Broken bones were common, as were cavities and abscesses in teeth. Many people suffered from both osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. Kentucky's hunter-gatherers believed in an afterlife, and certain campsites also served as burial grounds. They placed the dead in simple pits dug into the ground, or they laid the dead on the ground surface and then covered the body with soil. Sometimes the dead were buried with objects that held some personal, religious, or social meaning for the deceased or for their family and kin. These included spears, atlas, ornaments, turtle shell rattles, or lumps of red ochre pigment. And the hunter-gatherer shell mound campsites along the Green River in western Kentucky, personal accomplishments set some people or families apart. These people were buried with their dogs or with rare and very valuable items made from marine shell, non-local stone, or copper, like pendants, necklaces, and hairpins. The value of these items stemmed from the important symbolic or ritual meanings they held, and because they were made from non-local materials traded over hundreds of miles from their sources, the Great Lakes and the Appalachian Mountains. I'm stopping right here. The next topic is hunter-gatherer gardeners, 1000 BCE, CE 1000.